Hi everyone and welcome to part 4 of my paper testing series. This one is about watercolor. First things first, I'm not really a watercolor artist. I was always fascinated about the effects that can be achieved by using watercolor, but I've never really tested it by myself. So I was curious for myself to see how different papers work for watercolors. If you're interested in other mediums as well, I have done this paper check for graphite, for charcoal and for colored pencil as well. So these videos can be found on my channel and I would love if you would check them out. As for the other tutorials, my goal was not to achieve a high-end look to the piece, and I gave myself a time limit that was not allowed to be more than 30 minutes to complete each drawing, or painting in this course. And I have to say that watercolor went really quickly, so I only needed about 20 minutes per painting to complete. I only had to calculate drying time in between. For this tutorial I was using the Winsor & Newton watercolor basic set, so only a very limited palette, but for the painting that I wanted to do, this orchid here, I only used 3 different colors, so not much of a deal. In terms of paper, I wanted to use some paper which is available throughout the globe, so everywhere you can easily get these papers over Amazon or perhaps in your local art stores, or even if not these papers are available, even some quite similar papers. The first paper that I've used was the Stonehenge paper, which is quite thick, it has a bit of a texture and worked quite well for the watercolor. So the paper itself did not bend, the colors look vibrant, and when I was finished with the painting, the paper dried back flat into place, so quite a nice paper to work on. You have to consider this was only very small pieces that are taped to the board, so I will recommend to test it out first if you go for larger pieces, if the paper really holds its shape and does not bend or remains bent once dried. So I have not tested this one yet, as I would probably go for watercolor paper when I do bigger watercolor pieces once, perhaps. For the second painting I used the Bristol 300 Vellum series. This paper was quite nice as well. It's also thick, it has a bit of a texture, a bit less than the Stonehenge paper has, and it's a white paper as well. It was again taped and the color could be applied quite easily. I could move the color around, it has a vibrancy in it, so it was an okay paper to draw on. What I have tested after this tutorial, I wanted to do a watercolor background on a quite large piece, which was about 40 by 60 centimeters, and it was going to be a portrait with a watercolor background. This did not work that well. So I taped the paper to a wooden surface so that it was flat in the beginning, and applied the watercolor as I thought it would be the best idea to apply it. And of course the paper started to buckle a bit, which I hoped to be flat again once dried, but it was not. So the paper was too big to dry back flat into place. I tried several stuff to get it flat, by hair drying it, by ironing it, many different ways. All failed, so it did not end up well at all. And so I started over. For the next attempt I only used light layers. So in the first attempt I put all the watercolor that I wanted on the paper. So I wet the paper, I put the watercolor in, I put another layer on. So until I achieved the look that I wanted to have, which the look itself was great if I had dried back flat into place. So for the second attempt I did it in different layers. I added a soft layer, let it dry, added another layer, let it dry, and so on until I achieved somewhat the look that I wanted to achieve. You don't really get, or I did not get, the watercolory effect that I initially planned to have, but it turned out nice as well, so fine for me. And the paper dried flat back into place. So this was a way to achieve a watercolor background look on a large piece of paper which is not initially intended to be a watercolor paper. So if you're going to do or going to plan something like this as well, I recommend using this technique instead of putting all the watercolor that you want to have on the piece in one go. For the next paper, the Bristol 300 Smooth series, nothing else to say, it worked quite the same. there is a bit less texture on the paper than it was on the Vellum, and much less texture than there was on the Stonehenge paper, but it worked in a way quite similar, so I could not make out much difference to the watercolor techniques compared to the other ones. The first really difference was on the Strathmore toned 10 and toned grey paper, as these papers already have a tone to it, a beige one and a grey one, and these papers are quite thin as well. Although the papers are quite thin, they tried back into place flat. Yeah, these are tiny sheets, so I guess if you have a larger sheet like A4 or even bigger, you will not be able to achieve a flat paper once you've added the watercolor. Therefore the paper is just too thin, I think. I have not tried it, but I cannot imagine to have it tried flat. Although the applying technique was the same as for the other papers, as the papers are tanned, you do not get a vibrant look to the colors. If you have a look at the beginning of the video, when I showed you the overall picture of the complete tutorial, you can already see that the toned papers look very much darker than it was with the white papers. So I would not recommend these toned papers for watercolor at all. This was just for curiosity and to have the similar papers for each technique. The last paper that I've used was the Canson Aquarelle paper, which is actually the only intended watercolor paper that I used for these tutorials, and I have to say it worked the best. It is the thickest papers of all that I've tested, and it has the typical watercolor texture, and the watercolor effect was easiest and the best on this paper. So the colors are vibrant better, I think, than for the other papers. It of course dried back flat as the other papers did for the size that I've used, and the color itself moved best, I think, on this paper. So of course I would, from all the tested papers, I would recommend using a watercolor paper, and depending on what other techniques you're preferred to use or you're drawing or painting in, a watercolor paper can use different other mediums as well, so it is a quite nice paper. This more or less concludes this tutorial. It was made more or less out of fun and my own curiosity, as I did not know what to expect for watercolors. Again, I'm not a watercolor artist, so I did not expect to have fine art pieces on my own. It was more a fun part to do and a bit of a difference to the other 3 tutorials that I did, where the end result was a bit more finalized, I'd say. So nevertheless, I hope this video was of any use for you and you had some fun. I of course had some fun making it and would love to see you in my next videos. If you have any questions, please leave me in the comments. If you liked my video, give me a thumbs up, or even better, subscribe, or both. And I wish you a great rest of the day. See you soon. Bye bye.